The radio went silent at 2:17 a.m. Not static, not interference. Silent. 12 soldiers were still breathing inside Blackthorn Gorge, surrounded, wounded, running out of time, and the man in charge of saving them had just turned off the channel. Colonel Everett Shaw set down his headset, folded his hands, and said the storm made rescue operationally impossible. 40 trained pilots sat in that briefing room. Not one of them stood up. Then a woman nobody trusted walked to the front of the room, a pilot who had never run a rescue mission, who wasn't even certified on the only helicopter available, and said 3 words that changed everything. I can reach them. If this story already has your heart pounding, stay with me until the end. Drop your city in the comments right now so I can see exactly how far this story travels. And if you believe some people are worth going back for, like this video before we begin. The storm arrived without warning, the way the worst things always do. One moment, the sky above the Kharif wastes was a hard sheet of black stars. The next, a wall of orange dust 30 meters high swallowed the horizon whole and kept moving, fast, purposeful, like it had somewhere to be and didn't care what it destroyed getting there. Forward Base Talon wasn't built for beauty. It was built to survive. Reinforced sandbag walls, prefab metal housing units bolted to concrete pads, antenna arrays that rattled in even a moderate breeze. The perimeter lights had been blinking on and off since 1900 hours, a generator issue nobody had gotten around to fixing, and now those same amber lights strobed weakly through the dust cloud as the storm hit the base like a fist. Inside the Flight Operations Building, a long rectangular box that smelled permanently of hydraulic fluid and burnt coffee. The fluorescent overheads flickered twice and then dropped to emergency power. Half the room went dark. The mission maps pinned to the eastern wall disappeared into shadow. Nobody moved to turn on a flashlight, because at that exact moment, the radio operator pulled off his headset and said very quietly, "Echo Patrol is requesting immediate extraction. All comms still active. They're taking fire from the western ridge." The room went still in a different way than rooms go still when bad news arrives. This was the stillness of people who already knew what the next sentence was going to be before anyone said it. Colonel Everett Shaw stood at the head of the operations table. He was a thick man, built like someone had stacked 2 sandbags on top of each other and put a uniform on the pile. 16 years of command had given him the particular kind of stillness that gets mistaken for confidence. The ability to look completely unbothered while making decisions that would follow other people for the rest of their lives. He studied the weather display for exactly 4 seconds. The dust wall on the screen was a solid orange mass, no gaps, no pockets, swallowing the entire gorge region. "What's their status?" he asked. The radio operator, a young specialist named Reyes, didn't look up from the console. 12 personnel, 5 wounded. Corporal Monroe is... He paused, checking the signal. "Critical. They're sheltering in the lower gorge, western face. Enemy fighters on 3 sides, estimated 20 to 30 combatants." Shaw nodded slowly, like someone confirming information he had already decided wasn't going to change his answer. "Visibility at extraction point?" "0, sir. Storm's sitting right on top of the gorge. Wind speed variable, 40 to 70 knots at last reading." Shaw looked at the weather display one more time. Then he reached over and picked up his coffee cup and took a slow drink. And when he set it back down, he said, "We stand down. Mission suspended until weather clears." Reyes turned around in his chair. "Sir, Corporal Monroe is..." "I heard you, Specialist." Shaw's voice didn't change temperature at all. "We are not sending aircraft into a zero-vis dust storm at 40 knots. That's not a rescue. That's a second casualty incident. Stand down." He looked around the room. 40 pilots, crew chiefs, operations personnel. Most of them had been at Talon for at least 1 rotation. They knew what a bad weather call looked like, and they knew what a risk-averse colonel looked like. And in that moment, most of them were looking at something that fit both descriptions. But nobody spoke, because Colonel Shaw had a way of ending careers that was almost elegant in its efficiency. Not a single dramatic confrontation, just a slow accumulation of negative evaluations, missed recommendations, choice assignments that went to other people. You didn't have to do anything dramatic to get on his list. You just had to make him feel questioned. So 40 experienced military professionals sat in a half-dark room and said nothing while 12 people bled in a canyon 6 kilometers away. Lieutenant Claire Halden sat in the back row. She'd taken that seat deliberately. Not out of humility. She didn't think of herself as particularly humble, but because sitting in the back row of any room gave you a sight line the front row never had. You could see everything. Who was watching who? Who was already reaching for their notes before the briefing ended? Who was scared and hiding it? Right now, she could see that at least 8 people in this room wanted to say something and had made the calculation that it wasn't worth the cost. Claire was 30 years old, recently transferred from the 4th Attack Battalion, which was the kind of detail that told experienced people 2 things simultaneously. She was good enough to have been selected, and she hadn't been able to get along with whoever she'd been working under before. Both of those assessments were basically accurate. She'd been flying attack helicopters for 6 years, had a clean record in 3 operational theaters, and had parted ways with her previous commanding officer over a targeting decision she still believed had been correct and always would. At Talon, she was known mainly as the quiet pilot who studied maps, which was a polite way of saying nobody had bothered to know her yet. She was not close to the pilots in Echo Patrol. She hadn't served with most of them. She did not have a personal stake in the way that Caleb Dunn, the young private sitting 3 rows ahead of her, had a personal stake. She'd heard him on the phone earlier telling someone that his best friend Owen Pike was running a patrol in the gorge tonight. She didn't know Corporal Leah Monroe. She couldn't have picked her out of a lineup, but she had flown the terrain files on the Carif Wastes 6 weeks ago on a night when she couldn't sleep, studying grid squares that had nothing to do with her assigned patrol routes. She did this with a lot of terrain. It was the kind of obsessive pre-work that attack pilots either do religiously or not at all, and Claire did it religiously, mapping out canyon approaches and ridge elevations and wind channel behaviors that she would probably never need and couldn't stop herself from learning anyway. And because of that, she knew something about Blackthorn Gorge that the mission board didn't show. She looked at the weather display. She looked at the topographic overlay to its left. She traced a line with her eyes that she'd traced before in the quiet of the terrain analysis room, following the secondary canyon that cut northeast through the lower gorge, the one the Geological Survey had mapped in 2009, but that had never made it into the operational navigation database because nobody had thought it mattered. It mattered now. She sat with that knowledge for approximately 30 seconds. Then she stood up. "Sir." Shaw turned. The back of a room is a long walk in terms of how authority travels, and Shaw let his gaze make that journey slowly, taking in the fact that she was young, female, recently transferred, sitting in the back row. His expression didn't shift, but something in his eyes did a quick calculation. "Lieutenant, I know a route into the gorge." The room didn't go quiet because it was already quiet, but there was a quality of attention that shifted, the way attention shifts when something unexpected enters a room, and Claire felt it on the back of her neck like a change in air pressure. "The storm has shut down all primary approach vectors," Shaw said. It wasn't a question. It was a conclusion he was stating out loud so that everyone could hear her walk into it. "The primary vectors? Yes, sir." Claire moved forward, not to the map board because that would have been too presumptuous, but far enough that she wasn't shouting from the back row. "There's a secondary passage, northeast cut, lower gorge, runs behind the 3rd ridge face. The canyon walls there are averaging 22 meters on either side. It creates a natural windbreak. The storm velocity inside that channel would be significantly reduced." Silence. "You've flown that passage?" Shaw asked. "No, sir." "You've seen it at night?" "No, sir. I've studied the Geological Survey data and the—" "You haven't flown it." Shaw said it like he was handing her something back. "In a dust storm. At night? In a transport helicopter, you are not, if I recall correctly, rated on." A few people in the room shifted. Someone cleared their throat. "That's correct," Claire said. "I'm rated on the attack configuration, not the transport." "So you're proposing I authorize an unqualified pilot to fly an aircraft she's never operated, through a passage she's never seen, in 0 visibility conditions, at 0200 hours?" Shaw looked at her with the particular expression of a man who believes he's being generous by not laughing. "Based on a geological survey. Based on the physics of the canyon, sir, and the fact that 12 soldiers are still breathing and that in about 40 more minutes that number might change." The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. One of them was at half power, strobing slightly, and it made everyone's face look strange and shadowed. Captain Nolan Pierce was standing to Claire's left. He was 38, dark-haired, with the kind of lean face that looked permanently like he was working something out. He had said nothing during Shaw's announcement. He was saying nothing now. But he was watching Claire with an expression that was different from the rest of the room. Not the careful neutrality of people protecting their careers, not the skepticism of people who hadn't met her yet. He was listening. Shaw turned away from Claire and began gathering the papers in front of him. Request denied. We reassess when weather clears. Get some rest, Lieutenant. You've earned a good evaluation by showing initiative. He said the last part without any particular warmth, the way people say good effort to someone who has just lost. Claire looked at Pierce. Pierce looked at her. Then he said, Colonel, give her 30 minutes. Shaw stopped moving. 30 minutes, Pierce repeated, his voice level and unhurried. She puts together a flight plan, walks through the passage navigation, and I assess whether it's operable. If it doesn't hold up, we stand down. You lose nothing. Shaw was quiet for a long moment. He was doing the calculation. Pierce had more operational commendations than anyone else on base, which meant that overruling him on a weather call in front of 40 witnesses was the kind of decision that could generate questions if something went wrong tonight. You have 30 minutes, Shaw said finally, not to Claire, to Pierce. And you are not authorized to fly until I review the plan personally. He picked up his coffee and walked out. Pierce led her to the tactical planning room, a smaller space off the main corridor, maps lining 3 walls, a center table covered in aerial photographs. He pulled the geological survey file before she even asked for it, which told her something about how prepared he'd already been for this conversation. Walk me through it, he said. She went to the northeast quadrant of the gorge overlay and placed her finger on the secondary canyon cut. Here. It's not in the navigation database, but the walls are real. 22 meters average, some sections narrower. Maybe 14 at the tightest point. Rotor clearance? At the tightest point, we're talking roughly 3 meters either side. Maybe less. Pierce studied the map. His face didn't change. That's not a comfort margin, Halden. No, sir, but it's a margin. Wind? The canyon orientation runs almost perpendicular to the storm track. Natural channeling effect. I'd estimate actual wind speed inside the passage at 20% of external conditions. Maybe less. You'd estimate. I'd estimate, she agreed. Yes. Pierce was quiet. He walked around the table and looked at the passage from the other direction on the map, the way people do when they're trying to find the flaw in something they want to be true. You've never flown the transport config, he said. I've logged 40 hours in the sim, fully current on the system's manual. She paused. I know that's not the same as ours. It's really not. I'm aware. She met his eyes. But I also know the attack configuration. The transport variant uses the same control architecture. The handling is heavier, less responsive at low speed, but the instrument layout is identical. In a canyon passage at reduced power that actually works in our favor. Pierce pressed his palms flat on the table and looked at the map for a long time without speaking. 12 people, Claire said quietly. I know how many people there are. His voice wasn't sharp, just direct. And Corporal Monroe. He looked up at her. The radio report said critical, Claire said. I don't know what that means exactly. Could be she has 6 hours. Could be she doesn't have 40 minutes. She paused. I'm not saying that to push you. I'm saying it because it's information. Pierce straightened up, looked at the clock on the wall, looked at the weather display screen in the corner of the room where the storm still showed as an unbroken mass of orange. Strip the aircraft, he said. Sir? Everything that comes off, comes off. Weapons systems, armor plating, auxiliary fuel. I want that aircraft as light as you can make it without compromising critical systems. He was already moving toward the door. I'll deal with Shaw. You have 45 minutes to pre-flight. He stopped in the doorway. Halden, if you hesitate once inside that canyon, if your instinct tells you to pull back, you pull back. You don't fight your instincts in a 14-meter passage in a dust storm. Are we clear? Clear, sir. Good. He paused. Because I'm not explaining to 12 families why I sent an unrated pilot into a gorge in zero-viz conditions. He left. Claire stood alone in the tactical planning room for exactly 4 seconds. Then she went to find Staff Sergeant Valdez. Inez Valdez had been a crew chief for 9 years, which meant she had spent 9 years listening to pilots explain why the thing they were about to do was definitely not as crazy as it sounded. She had a gift for hearing the truth underneath the explanation, The way musicians can hear the wrong note in a chord 2 beats after it's already passed. She listened to Claire for about 90 seconds. Then she said, "You're stripping the weapons." "Yes. So if someone shoots at us, we can't shoot back." Valdez looked at her steadily. She was 29, compact, with dark eyes that processed information very fast and a habit of chewing the inside of her cheek when she was thinking hard. "Okay," she said. "Okay? Okay, I'm coming." Valdez was already moving toward the flight line. "The part where we can't shoot back is going to bother me the whole time, but okay. It bothers me too." "That's very comforting, Lieutenant." Private Caleb Dunn was waiting near the aircraft when they arrived. He was 22 years old and trying very hard to look older than he was, which meant he stood very straight and kept his hands deliberately still, but his eyes gave him away. His eyes were moving constantly, scanning the storm wall at the perimeter, calculating something that had nothing to do with flight logistics. "Private," Claire said, "this isn't mandatory." "Sergeant Pike is in there," Dunn said. "I know. Then there's nothing else to say, ma'am." Claire looked at him for a moment. He was young, genuinely young, the way people look before anything has really gone wrong for them yet. But his voice was steady, and she had learned to trust steady voices more than composed faces. "Get aboard," she said. The mechanics worked fast and without complaint. Weapons pods came off first, then the armor plating on the lower fuselage, then 3 auxiliary systems that added weight without contributing to the flight envelope they needed tonight. The aircraft that remained was stripped and strange-looking, like a bird that had shed half its feathers, exposed rivets where panels had been, open brackets where weapons had mounted. It looked vulnerable in the perimeter lights. It was lighter by 430 kilograms. Those 430 kilograms were the difference between fitting inside a 14-meter passage and not. Claire climbed into the cockpit and began running through the startup sequence. The instruments came up one by one: rotor speed, torque gauge, altimeter, the navigation display showing the terrain overlay she'd programmed in the last 20 minutes. The secondary passage was a thin blue line on the screen, barely visible against the terrain hash marks. She stared at that blue line. Outside, the storm was making a sound like radio static turned up to a frequency that existed somewhere below hearing, a pressure more than a sound, something you felt in your back teeth. She ran the startup checklist to the end. Then she keyed the radio. "Talon Control, this is Rescue Flight. Ready for departure on your authorization." A pause. Shaw's voice came back, cold, flat, each word separated by a half-second of space that managed to communicate contempt without any single word being contemptuous. "You are authorized. 30 minutes, Lieutenant. If you're not back with positive contact, we consider the mission failed, and I am not sending additional resources." Claire pressed her lips together. "Copy that," she said. She pushed the throttle up. The helicopter lifted off the pad and the storm swallowed it whole. The darkness inside the Kharif dust storm was a different kind of darkness than any other Claire had experienced, not the blackness of a moonless night, which still has depth and gradient, but an absolute suspended murk that seemed to exist in every direction simultaneously. The sand hitting the windshield sounded like static, like a signal desperately trying to resolve into something intelligible. The amber warning light on the instrument panel had been there since they cleared the perimeter. A minor hydraulic pressure fluctuation. The mechanics had flagged it before departure. Not critical, they said, probably a sensor artifact. But in the dark, and the noise it pulsed like a small and patient reminder that nothing about this situation was forgiving. Claire flew by instruments. Altitude, heading, rotor torque, terrain proximity. The gorge entrance was 3 kilometers ahead, and she would have to find it by the numbers because her eyes were giving her nothing useful. She could feel the turbulence changing texture, so smoother, then rough, then smooth again, as the storm interacted with the terrain features she couldn't see. "Coming up on the primary canyon mouth," she said aloud, less for Valdez, who could read the instruments herself, more for the act of saying it, making the next 30 seconds real by naming them. "I see it on the display," Valdez said from the right seat. Her voice was controlled, professional. But Claire could hear the thing underneath it, the thing trained people carry when they've made a decision they're not entirely certain about. The canyon walls materialized on the terrain display as 2 rising lines closing in from either side. "Tight," Valdez said. 14 meters at the tightest. We have clearance." We have clearance, Valdez said, with the particular emphasis of someone noting the distinction between having clearance and feeling comfortable about it. Claire reduced airspeed. 30 knots. 25. The rotors changed pitch in the confined space, a lower, more resonant note, the sound bouncing off stone walls and returning in fragments. She was navigating on echoes now as much as instruments. The rotor sound changed when they drifted toward a wall, a subtle compression in the audio environment that she'd read about in Canyon Flight Technique, and was now experiencing for the first time as a real thing and not a paragraph in a manual. The passage narrowed. She corrected left. The passage widened slightly. She breathed. Then the radio crackled. Not the bass frequency, the tactical channel. And a voice came through the static that was rough and low and exhausted, with gunfire audible in the background like distant hammers. Any aircraft. This is Echo Patrol. We are at grid 77 Foxtrot. 5 wounded, 1 critical. We need extraction now. If anyone is listening, the transmission broke up. Echo Patrol, this is rescue flight. Claire's voice surprised her. It sounded steadier than she felt. We are inbound to your position. Say again your exact location. Static. Then, barely audible. Foxtrot Ridge, we're taking fire from... Claire? Is that... She didn't recognize the voice, but whoever it was knew her name, which meant someone on that patrol had been at Talon long enough to hear about the quiet pilot who studied maps. I'm here, she said. Stay low. We're coming. She banked left into the secondary passage. The canyon walls came up so close that for one heartbeat they were simply there, stone and darkness on either side. The rotor tips a matter of feet from rock, and then the passage opened slightly and she was through the worst of it, and the wind dropped. Dropped significantly, the aircraft steadying underneath her like something solid had grabbed hold. There it is, she thought. The natural windbreak, exactly where the geological survey said it would be. 3 minutes later, the headlights found the patrol. They were sheltered against the western face, 12 figures in the cone of light, several of them carrying others. Someone was holding a field dressing to their own thigh. Someone else was firing in short bursts at the ridge above them while the others moved. Claire dropped the helicopter onto the only flat stone in the immediate vicinity. It wasn't quite flat. It angled maybe 4 degrees to the west, just enough to make every system in her body want to correct for it. She didn't shut down. She kept the rotors turning. Go, she told Dunn. He was out the door before she finished the word. The loading took 3 minutes and 11 seconds. Claire knew because she was counting, not consciously, but the part of her brain that tracks elapsed time under stress was running the clock without being asked, and it reached 3 minutes and 11 seconds at the exact moment a burst of fire from the western ridge struck the tail assembly with a sound like someone had hit the aircraft with a wrench. The aircraft yawed, hard. Claire corrected, overcompensated, corrected again. We're hit, Valdez said, already checking the tail rotor system on her display. Tail rotor authority reduced, maybe 60%. Can we fly? We can fly. Then we fly. Claire looked back into the cabin. Dunn was pulling the last figure aboard, a soldier with a bandage wrapped around her head, barely conscious, being half carried by 2 others. How many? 7, Dunn called. 7. They had 12. That meant 5 still on the ground. Which 5? Pike is staying. Dunn's voice didn't waver, but it cost him something. He says there's not enough room. Monroe's one of the 5. She's... He stopped. She's not good, ma'am. Claire looked at the fuel state, looked at the tail rotor indicator still showing reduced authority, looked at the canyon walls visible in the lights, the stone pressing in on both sides. Tell Pike we're coming back, she said. She pulled pitch. The helicopter clawed upward through the canyon, and the storm hit them again like a wall, and the entire aircraft shuddered, and the tail fought her on every correction. But they were climbing, they were through the passage, they were out. At Forward Base Talon, the mechanics met them on the flight line, and one of them, a senior warrant officer named Costa, looked at the tail assembly for about 8 seconds, and then turned to Claire with an expression that said what his words were about to say before he said them. She's not safe to fly again tonight, Lieutenant. Claire looked at the empty seats in the cabin, looked at the 5 names she was still carrying, looked at Costa. Patch it, she said. Costa looked back at her. Patch it, she said again, and do it fast. 16 minutes later, she was back in the cockpit. The base lights were shrinking behind her in the mirror. Shaw's voice hit the radio like something thrown. "Lieutenant Halden, you are not authorized for a second flight. Do you copy? You are not—" She switched channels. The canyon swallowed her again. And this time, the storm was worse. The storm hadn't gotten worse in the 16 minutes she'd been gone. It had gotten personal. That was the only way Claire could describe it later. In the brief moments when she tried to describe it at all, the sense that the Kharif dust storm had spent those 16 minutes reorganizing itself specifically for her return. The wind vectors had shifted maybe 12 degrees northeast, which didn't sound like much until you were threading a stripped-down helicopter through a 14-meter canyon passage, and those 12 degrees meant the crosswind was now hitting the open tail assembly at an angle that made every correction feel like arm wrestling, something that didn't get tired. She'd switched Shaw's channel off before she cleared the perimeter. She knew what that meant. She knew exactly what that meant. Disobeying a direct order from a superior officer was not a gray area in any military code she'd ever read, and she had read most of them. But there was a version of this night where she landed that helicopter, sat down with a cup of bad coffee, and spent the rest of her career explaining to review boards why she had made the rational choice at 0230 hours while Corporal Leah Monroe's family got a phone call. She couldn't find that version of herself. So she flew. The instrument panel was doing something it hadn't done on the first run. The altimeter was stuttering, not dramatically, just a 2 or 3 meter fluctuation that kept correcting itself, probably a pressure sensor reacting to the canyon environment and the reduced hull mass. She logged it mentally and moved past it. You could spend the whole flight worrying about the things that might kill you, or you could fly the aircraft. She'd learned that in her second year of operational flying from a chief warrant officer named Garza, who had approximately 0 patience for what he called narrating your own death. You see it, you note it, you manage it, you move. The moment you start explaining it to yourself is the moment you stop flying. The secondary passage came up faster on the second approach. She'd memorized the shape of it on the first run, not consciously, but the way the hands remember a movement that the brain hasn't cataloged yet. She reduced airspeed to 28 knots and felt the canyon walls rise around her on the terrain display and reduced again to 22, and then the wind dropped and the aircraft settled and she was in. Valdez hadn't said anything since they left the perimeter. That wasn't anxiety. Claire had already figured out that Valdez went quiet when she was working, running her own parallel assessment of every system the aircraft had. The way a good crew chief treats a flight as a continuous conversation with the machine. She'd glance at the tail rotor indicator, glance at hydraulic pressure, glance at the engine temp display, all of it quick and unhurried, like someone reading a book they've already memorized but are checking for changes. Tail authority? Claire asked. Holding at 58%, down 2 from last time. Can you compensate manually if it drops further? I can compensate manually if a lot of things happen, Valdez said. Whether that'll feel like flying or feel like falling is a different question. Fair answer. I'm a fair person. In the back, Dunn was quiet. He'd been quiet since they lifted off. Claire had checked on him once during the base turnaround. He was sitting against the starboard bulkhead with his rifle across his knees, staring at the middle distance while the mechanics worked on the tail assembly. And she'd asked him if he was all right, and he'd said yes, ma'am, in the particular way that people say it when the honest answer is something more complicated, and they've decided the middle of an active mission isn't the time for complicated. She hadn't pushed. She needed him functional, not processed. The passage widened at the 2/3 point, the place where she'd felt the aircraft settle on the first run, and she let herself take one full breath. Just one. Then she was back on the instruments, reading the terrain display, watching the canyon walls curve northeast toward the extraction position. The tactical radio had been intermittent since she'd left the base. The storm was eating signal, converting transmissions into fragments and gaps. She'd caught one partial message from Pike on the first leg of the return journey. The transmission kept breaking up, but she'd made out enough to know they were still holding position, still taking fire, that Monroe's condition hadn't improved. She keyed the channel now. Echo Patrol, this is rescue flight. Second approach. Give me a status. Static. A long 3 seconds of it. Then Pike's voice, closer than she expected, as if he'd moved to a better transmission position. Rescue flight, copy. We have 4 packs. Monroe is a burst of static. She's not... You need to know, if she's not moving when we load her, that's not... She's still alive. Just barely. Copy. Monroe first, then the others. We'll handle her, Sergeant. You got a medical? We have Valdez. A pause. The quality of it wasn't doubt exactly. More like Pike processing the gap between what he needed and what was available, deciding whether to name it. He didn't name it. Okay, he said. Come in from the northeast. They've been moving along the western ridge. Looks like they're trying to get an angle on your approach route. You come in from the northeast, you've got the eastern face blocking their sight lines. How long will that hold? 10 minutes, maybe. Then I'm already late, Claire said, and she pushed the airspeed up. The eastern face of the gorge materialized on her left as she came out of the passage, not as a visual, but as a change in the echo pattern of the rotors, the sound bouncing back harder and faster from the stone. She was flying in a space she could not see, navigating by instruments and sound, and the faint memory of the terrain data she'd studied in a planning room 6 weeks ago, and a radio signal from a man on the ground she'd never met until 40 minutes ago. The lights found them at the base of the eastern wall. 4 figures, 3 upright, 1 not. She put the aircraft down in a different spot than the first extraction. The flat stone where she'd landed before was now exposed to the western ridge. Pike had been right about that. And the alternative was a narrow shelf of ground between 2 boulder formations that the landing gear could just barely straddle if she came in at the right angle. She came in at the right angle. It was not a gentle landing. The left gear hit stone a half second before the right, and the aircraft skipped sideways maybe 30 centimeters before she corrected. And for one moment, the rotor blade clearance on the left boulder was something she would not have wanted measured. But the gear held. The aircraft held. Go, she said. Dunn went. Valdez was already out of the right seat, moving to the rear cabin, pulling the medical kit from the bracket on the starboard wall. She'd assessed what they had on the first turnaround, which wasn't much. The stripped aircraft had lost 2 of its 3 trauma bags along with everything else. But she'd restocked from the base medical station in the same 16 minutes the mechanics had been working on the tail. And now she had enough to do something, maybe, depending on what she was walking into. What she walked into was Leah Monroe. Claire heard Valdez's voice change as she reached her. Not dramatically, not panic, just the subtle compression of a person who has assessed a situation and immediately understood that it is significantly worse than the best-case scenario they'd been carrying in the back of their mind. A controlled intake of breath that had nothing controlled about it underneath. She has a pulse, Valdez called. Copy, Claire said. It's there, get her in. Gunfire hit the eastern face somewhere above them, not aimed at the aircraft, but close enough that the stone fragments from the impact point scattered across the fuselage roof. Dunn had Pike by the arm, helping him move. The sergeant was wounded in his left leg. Claire could see that from the cockpit, moving with the particular careful economy of someone managing significant pain and not willing to put words to it. The 2 remaining soldiers from Echo Patrol had Monroe between them, half carrying her, and the loading was fast, but it wasn't clean because loading an unconscious critical patient into a light helicopter in a dust storm while someone fires at the rock face above you is not a procedure that has a clean version. The aircraft rocked as they came aboard. Weight shifting. 600 kilograms of human beings distributing themselves across a hull that had not been designed to be optimistic about weight margins. How many? Claire called. All 4, Dunn said. We're in. She pulled pitch. The aircraft came up heavy and slow, the way it should with a full load, but the tail was a different conversation now. At 58% authority, the yaw correction that should have been automatic and immediate was instead a negotiation. She asked the tail to hold, and it held, but she could feel the half-second delay in every response, the way you can feel it when something in a machine is working harder than it wants to. She got the nose around and pushed into the passage. The walls came up, and something changed. The crosswind, which had been pushing northeast on the approach, had shifted again. Only a few degrees, but inside a 14-meter passage, a few degrees of wind shift is not a meteorological footnote. It's a wall. Claire felt the aircraft push left against the canyon wall, the tail losing authority for a full second in the wind eddy, and she corrected with the cyclic while adding right pedal, and the correction worked, but it worked late. The rotor blades sweeping left in the darkness closer to the stone than any instrument on the panel could measure in real time. She held everything she had absolutely still for 3 seconds. The eddy passed. The aircraft straightened. She breathed. That was close, Valdez said. I noticed. I want you to know I noticed it also. I want you to keep monitoring the tail authority. I am absolutely doing that, Valdez said. It's at 54. Down 4 more. The repair was working, but not as well as the mechanics had hoped, and the combined stress of the first flight and the loaded second run was wearing something down that couldn't be unworn. Costa had told her the patch would hold for one more flight. He'd said it like a man who believed what he was saying while also hoping he was right. Behind her, Valdez was doing something with Monroe that Claire couldn't see and didn't try to see because everything she had needed to stay on the passage. But she could hear it, the steady, low sound of Valdez's voice, not talking to Claire, talking to Monroe, saying things like, "Stay with me, and I need you to breathe," and once, very quietly, "Don't you dare," which was not a medical term but was exactly the right thing to say. Pike's voice came from somewhere in the cabin. "How much longer?" 2 minutes to clear the passage, Claire said. "Then another 4 to base." "Monroe doesn't have—" He stopped. "Can we go faster?" "Not in the passage. After that, yes." A silence. Then, "Okay?" "Just that." "Okay." The word carrying everything he wasn't saying about the person lying behind him and whatever it meant to him that she was still breathing and what it would mean if she stopped. The passage widened. The wind built again as the canyon walls fell away and the full force of the storm hit the aircraft like it had been waiting patiently at the exit. And Claire pushed the nose forward and the aircraft accelerated and the lights of forward base Talon appeared in the bottom left corner of the windshield as a dim orange smear through the dust. She was 3 kilometers out when the tail assembly made a sound. It wasn't a loud sound. That was the part she'd think about later. How quiet it was, given what it meant. A sharp mechanical report, like something had let go of something it had been holding very tightly. And then the aircraft yawed left with a force that had nothing negotiated about it. Nothing delayed, just immediate and violent rotation. And the tail authority indicator dropped off the display entirely because there was no longer anything to indicate. The aircraft spun, 1 full rotation. Maybe 1.5. Claire reduced collective, dropped the nose, entered the auto-rotation before her conscious mind had finished processing what was happening. Training running on a track below thought, hands and feet doing what they'd drilled thousands of times in simulators and twice in actual emergency situations. The aircraft falling in a controlled way now instead of an uncontrolled way, which was the only distinction that mattered. She had maybe 8 seconds to find the ground. The terrain display showed the canyon floor, uneven, several large rock formations, and in the bottom left of the display, barely visible, a section of ground that was not flat, but flatter, relatively, compared to everything around it. She aimed for it. The aircraft hit the ground hard, not a landing, a controlled impact, which is a different thing. The left gear failed first. She felt it go. The whole aircraft tilting left and then the right gear hit, and the momentum was still carrying them forward and sideways simultaneously, and the rotor blades struck the canyon wall once, twice, and then everything stopped. The sound stopped. The instrument panel was dark except for 1 amber light, blinking patiently in the wreckage. Claire became aware of several things in sequence: that she was upright, that the aircraft was at a roughly 30-degree angle, that she could hear the storm outside but couldn't hear the rotors anymore, that her left shoulder was producing a pain signal that her brain had decided to table for the moment. She keyed the radio. It was dead. She reached up and pulled the emergency beacon switch. A small LED on the panel went red, active, transmitting, and she held on to that red light for a moment like it was something solid. Then Valdez's voice came from the cabin. "Monroe has a pulse." Claire closed her eyes, opened them. "Done?" "Here, ma'am." His voice was tight but present. "Pike?" "Here." A pause. "Legs worse. I can still move." She undid her harness. Her shoulder screamed at her when she used that arm to push up out of the seat, and she switched to the right arm and got herself upright and moved into the cabin. The interior was tilted and dim, the emergency lighting running on battery, casting everything in a greenish half-dark. Valdez was crouched over Monroe, both hands working with focused deliberateness. The 2 Echo Patrol soldiers were upright, checking each other over. One of them had a gash on his forehead that was bleeding steadily but not alarmingly. Dunn was at the rear bulkhead, rifle in hand, looking at the canyon walls through the shot-out cabin window. Pike was on the floor. His left leg was worse than she'd thought. The original wound had torn further in the impact, and the bandaging was saturated. He'd seen her looking and was already pulling a fresh field dressing from his vest with the controlled movements of a man who had decided what the next 30 seconds needed to look like, regardless of how he felt about it. "Rescue beacon is transmitting," Claire said. "Pierce knows the grid. He had a ground team on standby. They should be—" "How far?" Pike asked. She checked her watch. 10 minutes. Maybe less if they moved when the beacon went active. Pike looked at the canyon walls above them. His expression did the calculation that all of them were doing, where the enemy fighters were, how fast they'd move toward a downed aircraft, whether 10 minutes was a number that meant something tonight or just a number. "We need to hold position," Claire said. "I know." "Can you shoot?" He looked at his leg, looked at his rifle. "Yeah, I can shoot." "Then we hold." She looked at Dunn, at the 2 Echo Patrol soldiers, at Valdez still working over Monroe without looking up. "We use the aircraft as cover. Dunn, southern approach. Reyes." She pointed at one of the Echo Patrol men, guessing from his bearing that he was Reyes. He nodded. "Eastern wall. Pike, you take the southern ridge line from inside the cabin. You don't need to move for that." Nobody argued. Nobody looked at her like she was the wrong person to be saying this. There wasn't time for that, which was the only reason it didn't happen, and she knew that, and she filed it away. She checked her sidearm. Standard 9mm, standard magazine, 2 spares on her vest. Not a lot of firepower for an inbound contact of 20 to 30 combatants. But contact hadn't happened yet, and 10 minutes was still 10 minutes. Then Valdez said, "She's breathing better." Claire turned. Valdez looked up from Monroe for the first time in what might have been 5 minutes or 15. Her hands were still on Monroe's chest, feeling the rise and fall of it. "Whatever she's fighting," Valdez said, "she hasn't stopped yet." Claire looked at Leah Monroe. The young corporal was pale in the emergency lighting, unconscious, with a field dressing on the right side of her head and another wrapped around her torso. She looked like she weighed about 110 pounds, which meant she'd been carrying everything that had happened to her tonight in a body that wasn't built for it. The vital signs monitor Valdez had clipped to her finger was reading a number Claire wasn't qualified to fully interpret, but that Valdez was apparently interpreting as still in the fight. Outside, the storm howled, and then, from somewhere in the northeast wall of the canyon, a sound that was not the storm. Footsteps. More than one person. Moving carefully, but moving. Dunn looked at Claire. His face was absolutely steady except for one thing. His grip on the rifle had tightened, and she could see the knuckles even in the bad light. She raised her sidearm, checked the magazine, seated it, 10 minutes. She started counting. 1 minute gone, 9 left. The footsteps stopped. That was worse. Moving targets made sound, gave direction, let you track and anticipate. Targets that stopped moving had made a decision about where they were, and they were waiting for you to do something first. Claire held position behind the nose of the wrecked aircraft, or what remained of it, the crumpled forward section now providing maybe 40 centimeters of cover if she pressed herself flat against the left side, which she was doing. The emergency light inside the cabin was still on, which meant from outside the aircraft was a dim greenish beacon in the dark, and every person sheltering near it was silhouetted against it. "Kill the interior light," she said quietly. She heard Valdez move. A click. The cabin went dark. Better. Not good, but better. The storm was the problem, not just the visibility, not just the noise, but the way it moved across the canyon floor in irregular gusts, carrying sand that sounded like footsteps, masking actual footsteps, making every rustle and scrape from the eastern wall into something that could be wind or could be a man moving in a crouch at 10 meters. Dunn was behind the south boulder. She could see the edge of his shoulder, but not his face. He'd gone still in a way that young soldiers either learn fast or don't learn at all. The 2 Echo Patrol survivors, Reyes and a man whose name she still didn't know, were positioned on the eastern face, pressed flat against the stone, rifles up. Pike was inside the cabin. His leg had stopped being something he could pretend wasn't happening, and she'd watched him make the quiet decision to manage it by simply not looking at it, placing his rifle across the broken edge of the cabin doorframe, sighting northeast where the passage mouth was. "How many you think?" Dunn asked. It was barely a whisper. "Stop guessing," Claire said. It doesn't help. She heard him almost say something, and then not say it. She checked her watch. 1 minute, 40 seconds. The emergency beacon was still transmitting. She had to believe it was still transmitting because the alternative was a math problem she didn't want to solve. 8 people in a wrecked aircraft in the bottom of a canyon with 4 magazines of pistol ammunition and whatever the rifle teams were carrying against an unknown number of combatants who had spent the last hour getting very motivated about this particular canyon. A piece of rock fell from the eastern wall. Small, the size of a fist. Then another. Then Reyes fired twice, and the canyon walls threw the sound back at them in overlapping echoes, and someone in the darkness above shouted something, not in any language Claire knew, and then it was everywhere at once. Muzzle flashes from 3 points on the ridge, rounds coming in low and fast, one of them striking the aircraft fuselage with a sound like a hammer on sheet metal, another taking a chunk from the boulder 12 inches from Dunn's left ear. "Contact east and south," Reyes called. "I see south," Dunn said. He fired 3 times. "One down." Claire was firing at the muzzle flash on the eastern ridge. Controlled pairs, front sight, trigger press, front sight again. Not burning through the magazine, but not sitting on rounds either. The flash stopped after her 4th pair. She didn't know if she'd hit something or if the shooter had moved. The shooting stopped as suddenly as it started. A pause in the middle of contact that wasn't a ceasefire, just both sides reassessing. It lasted maybe 12 seconds and felt like 2 minutes. "Anybody hit?" Claire called. Nobody answered in the affirmative. She took that as a no. "Reload if you need to." She dropped her partial magazine, seated a fresh one, listened. From inside the cabin, Pike's voice came back careful and controlled. "There's movement at the passage mouth. 2, maybe 3. They're moving slow, trying to come around the south." "They're flanking," Claire said. "Yeah." She looked at the south position. Dunn had one angle on it. If they came around the boulder formation, he'd lose that angle. And she was the only other person on the south side of the wreck. Her shoulder had stopped negotiating with her at some point in the last 10 minutes. It had simply become a constant loud signal that she was managing the way she managed the altimeter fluctuation earlier. Noted, logged, not acted on. The arm still worked, mostly. Raising it above shoulder height produced a specific quality of pain that she'd learned to work around. 3 minutes, 20 seconds. "Pierce is still 6 minutes out," she said. She said it like a fact, not like a problem. "We hold." Nobody said anything about what 6 minutes meant. Dunn understood without being told and moved south, pressing tight to the boulder, adjusting his angle. Claire shifted to cover the gap he'd left. She was now the primary position on the eastern approach, which meant she was also the most exposed position of the 4, which she had made a deliberate choice about and wasn't going to revisit. The wind shifted. For about 4 seconds, the dust thinned, and in those 4 seconds, the emergency lighting from a point above the passage mouth caught 3 figures moving in a crouch along the canyon floor, moving fast, not the cautious approach from before. She fired at the lead figure. Missed. Fired again. The figure dropped behind a rock formation. The other 2 opened up from the rock, and rounds hit the wreck in a fast, angry sequence, and one of them came through the cabin window, and Claire heard Valdez make a sound, short and involuntary, and immediately suppressed, and her heart rate spiked at something that had nothing to do with the shooting. "Valdez." "I'm fine." A pause. "Monroe's fine." "You sure you're—" "I said, I'm fine, Lieutenant. Keep shooting." She kept shooting. The figure she'd dropped behind the rock was moving. Not retreating, repositioning, moving laterally to the west, trying to get an angle on the cabin door. She tracked the movement and fired once and heard something strike rock at a slightly different pitch than rock on rock, and the movement stopped. The other 2 were still in position, not advancing, not retreating, waiting. And from the southern approach, the sound of Dunn firing, 3 shots, then 2 more. No return fire from that direction after the second burst. "Clear south," Dunn said. He sounded like he couldn't quite believe it. 4 minutes, 10 seconds. They could do this. She did the math quickly. 6 positions of contact had been reduced to 2. Pierce's team was moving, the beacon was transmitting, and the canyon walls were providing the kind of terrain advantage that people with rifles and covered positions have over people in the open. They could do this. Then the shot came from directly above, not from the ridge in the distance. From the canyon wall 30 meters overhead, which meant someone had climbed in the dark and the storm and found a position that looked straight down into the open top of the cabin, straight down at where Valdez and Monroe were. Claire heard the round hit. Then she heard Valdez shout, not in pain, a warning shout. And then the next round hit the aircraft, and then there was a half second where she understood what was happening and what would happen next, and there was only one thing to do about it. She moved, not around the aircraft, over it. She came up over the nose section of the wreck, her left shoulder taking the weight as she pushed up onto the crumpled metal, and the pain was bad enough that her vision went gray at the edges for a full second, and she kept moving through the gray because the alternative was Valdez and Monroe in an open cabin with someone directly above them. She found the shooter by the muzzle flash, upper canyon wall, a natural ledge at maybe 28 meters elevation, a figure pressed flat against the stone with a rifle aimed down at the cabin. She fired 4 times. The first 2 were wide. She could see the stone kick up to the left of the figure. The third was close enough that the figure flinched and the aim shifted and the round went into the canyon floor instead of the cabin. The fourth hit something, she didn't know what, but the figure on the ledge moved in a way that people move when something has struck them, a sharp involuntary recoil, and then the rifle went still. She held her position on top of the wreck, exposed, shoulder screaming, the storm driving sand directly into her face, and watched the ledge. The rifle didn't move again. She slid back down the fuselage, and her shoulder hit the ground on the way down, and the gray came back harder this time, closer to black, and she sat against the nose section for a moment with her pistol up, processing. "You all right?" Valdez's voice from inside. "Working on it?" Claire pressed her back against the metal. "How's Monroe?" "Pulse is steady. She didn't move." "Good. Keep her down." "She's unconscious, Lieutenant. She's about as down as it gets." Despite everything, something in Claire almost smiled. Almost. 4 minutes, 50 seconds. The 2 remaining positions on the Eastern Rock Formation hadn't moved in almost 3 minutes. That was information. Either they were being disciplined and patient, or they were waiting for additional forces to come through the passage from the north, or something else had changed that she couldn't see. 3 possibilities, and she couldn't eliminate any of them with the information she had. She keyed the emergency radio, the one on her vest, not the aircraft system, which was long dead. Static. She keyed it again. "Pierce. Any station, this is rescue flight. Beacon grid, negative comms. Ground situation is..." The static broke, and Pierce's voice came through with a quality of background noise that suggested he was moving while transmitting. "Halden. We have your beacon. We are 200 meters north of the passage mouth, moving fast. ETA 4 minutes. What's your ground status?" 2 active positions, Eastern Rock Formation. Approximate range 30 meters from the aircraft. 1 elevated shooter neutralized. South is clear. We have wounded aboard. "Monroe?" "Alive, breathing, stable as we can make her." A pause in the transmission that lasted exactly as long as it took Pierce to file that information in whatever part of his mind he kept things that mattered. "Copy. Listen to me carefully. When you hear us on the northern bend, the shooting will start from our side. You move immediately. You don't wait for it to stop. You move. Take Monroe out the cabin door west side. There's a run of ground between the wreck and the western wall. 40 meters, then cover. We'll press east from the north. You understand?" "Understood. 40 meters west." "Don't wait for a pause. Move when you hear us, the moment you hear us." "Copy." She pulled herself back to the cabin door. Inside, Valdez had Monroe choused in a position that would allow for fast movement. Both arms, modified carry, the way you carry someone who can't help you carry them. She'd also produced, from somewhere in her vest, a second sidearm that she'd apparently been keeping in reserve as a secondary option, and it was now tucked into her waistband in a way that said she'd thought ahead about what the next 4 minutes might require. Claire had not told her to do any of this. She'd just done it. "Pierce is 4 minutes out," Claire said. Valdez nodded. 40 meters west when we hear them." "You heard the transmission." "I always hear the transmission." The 2 eastern positions opened up again. Not concentrated fire, suppression, covering fire for movement, which meant somebody was moving and somebody else was keeping their heads down. Rounds hit the western face of the canyon above them. Not aimed, just volume. The kind of firing that makes people stay small and stay still. Reyes returned fire from the eastern wall. The unnamed Echo Patrol soldier fired from behind the boulder. Claire leaned around the cabin doorframe and fired twice, and pulled back before whoever was moving could acquire her. Pike's voice from inside pressed against the frame. Northern approached. 2 figures, fast. Ours or theirs? He was quiet for 1 second, 2 seconds, then, ours. And the shooting started from the north. Not suppression, not volume fire, but the controlled, disciplined tempo of people who know exactly where they're going and what they need to accomplish to get there. 2 weapons, then 3, then a 4th, working the eastern rock formation from an angle that the fighters inside it had no prepared position against. Claire stood up. Move, she said. Valdez lifted Monroe. Claire got under the other arm, and the 3 of them came out of the cabin door in a way that had nothing graceful about it. Valdez's feet hit the canyon floor wrong, and she stumbled and corrected. Claire's shoulder took Monroe's weight for 1 step, and the gray came back, and she switched sides, and they were moving. The western wall ahead of them, 40 meters of open ground with rounds crossing overhead in both directions. The stone under her boots uneven and treacherous. She didn't count the meters. She just moved. Behind her, Dunn had Pike's arm across his shoulders, moving fast despite the leg, making sounds that were probably involuntary and that Pike would deny later. Reyes and the unnamed soldier moved with their rifles up, watching the eastern formation where Pierce's team was still working. The western wall hit Claire's free hand like something she'd been reaching for in the dark. She pressed Monroe against it. Valdez was already there, checking pulse, checking airway, hands moving with the automatic precision of someone who has temporarily shut off the part of their brain that processes fear in order to let the part that knows medicine do its job. She's still with us, Valdez said. The firing from the eastern formation had dropped by half. Pierce's team was through the worst of it, pressing forward, methodical. One of the fighters broke cover. She saw him for half a second, running south, before Reyes fired twice and he didn't run anymore. And then Pierce was there. Physically there, in front of her, in dust-covered body armor with a radio handset in one hand and a rifle in the other, looking at Claire the way people look when they've been told one thing and arrived to find the reality is slightly more complicated. He looked at her left arm, at the way she was holding it, at the pistol in her right hand still up and covering the eastern wall. You're hurt, he said. Later, she said. His expression was not what she expected. Not relief, not recrimination, not the face of a superior officer conducting a rapid assessment of an unauthorized mission. It was something simpler than all of that. The face of a person who has just arrived somewhere that matters and found people still alive who should not have been, and is processing what that means while simultaneously doing 4 other things. He turned to his team. Medevac LZ is 300 meters north. Move Monroe first. Move now. 2 of his people took Monroe from Valdez with smooth professional efficiency, and they were moving before the sentence was fully out, not running but fast, the particular controlled fast of people carrying a casualty who cannot be jostled. The rest of you, Pierce said, on me. We cover the south. He looked at Claire one more time, just for a second. Nice to see you, Lieutenant, he said. She lowered her pistol. Her shoulder was producing a quality of pain that she was going to have to actually address in the next few minutes, whether she wanted to or not. Her right hand was shaking slightly. She noticed this with a kind of detached interest. The way you notice details after something that required your entire attention has ended. She had 4 rounds left in her current magazine, and she could not immediately remember firing the others. Dunn was beside her. Pike was leaning against the canyon wall 3 meters away, the field dressing on his leg now fully saturated, watching the south with his rifle up despite everything. We good? Dunn asked. Claire looked at the wrecked helicopter. The emergency light in the cabin was still blinking amber, the one system that had apparently survived the crash, pulsing patiently in the dark like it was still trying to tell her something. She thought about the 16 minutes on the ground at Talon when she'd told Costa to patch it. She thought about the moment the tail had let go and the aircraft had spun, and she'd felt the absence of control as something physical, a void beneath her hands where there was supposed to be a machine she could reason with. She thought about Leah Monroe's pulse under Valdez's fingers, present when it had no particular reason to be. Yeah, she said. We're good. Pierce's team moved them north through the canyon while the rear element covered, and the shooting faded behind them, with the particular quality of a storm finally losing interest in a specific piece of ground. The medevac helicopter was loud and bright at the LZ, a proper aircraft, fully equipped, staffed, authorized, everything that tonight's original plan was supposed to have provided and hadn't. Monroe went aboard first. Claire watched the medical personnel take over from Valdez, watched Valdez step back and let them, watched the medevac lift off and disappear north into the thinning edge of the storm. She sat down on the canyon floor. Not dramatically, not because she decided to. Her legs simply made the decision independently, and she accepted the outcome. The stone was cold through her flight suit, and her shoulder was sending signals that were no longer ignorable. And she sat there with her back against the eastern wall and watched the sky above the canyon where the storm was beginning, very slowly, to pull apart at the edges. Pierce walked over and crouched beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at the sky. "Monroe's going to surgery," he said finally. "I know. Shaw is—" He paused, chose his words. "Shaw is currently explaining to the base operations center why there is a destroyed helicopter in Blackthorn Gorge." Claire closed her eyes. "He's calling it unauthorized," Pierce said. "Destroyed military property. Mission conducted outside authorized parameters." He was quiet for a moment. "He'll file the paperwork in the morning." She opened her eyes, looked at Pierce. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who has already made a decision and is informing her of it, not consulting her. "There are 12 people alive tonight who weren't supposed to be," he said. "I intend to make sure everyone who matters knows exactly how that happened." She didn't answer. The wind moved through the canyon, quieter now, carrying the last of the storm's edges across the stone. Somewhere above them, the sky was beginning to do the thing it does at 0400 hours in the Kharif wastes. Not quite dark, not quite light, a gray that wasn't gray, a threshold color. Dunn was sitting 20 meters away with Pike's arm around his shoulders, not out of necessity anymore, just sitting that way. The way people sit after something is over and they haven't quite found the moment to stop being close to each other. Claire looked at her pistol in her hand. 4 rounds left. She engaged the safety and holstered it. Her shoulder was going to need imaging, possibly something more than imaging. She was aware that at some point in the next several hours, she was going to stop running on whatever her body had been running on tonight, and she was going to feel the full accounting of it, and that was fine. That was what tomorrow was for. Tonight she sat in the canyon and watched the sky come apart and thought about exactly nothing. It felt like the most honest thing she'd done in a long time. The sky was doing the 400 thing when they walked her out of the canyon, not carried. She'd made that clear to the 2 soldiers who'd approached with the stretcher. She was walking, her shoulder was a problem she'd deal with at the aid station, and if they wanted to help, they could help Pike, who had an actual structural issue with his leg, and wasn't being nearly loud enough about it. They'd looked at each other, and then at Pierce, who had made a small gesture that meant let her, and that had been the end of the stretcher conversation. The walkout was 300 meters of uneven canyon floor, and Claire made it in 11 minutes, which was slower than she wanted and faster than her shoulder thought was reasonable. By the time they reached the northern passage mouth where Pierce's vehicles were staged, the adrenaline that had been running her operational systems for the last 2 hours had begun its recession, and she could feel the shape of what was underneath it. Not pain exactly, more like the promise of pain, a detailed invoice for everything she'd asked her body to do tonight that was currently being prepared for delivery. She sat in the back of Pierce's transport vehicle while a medic named Ochoa told her in clinical terms what he was seeing with her shoulder. Words like possible subluxation and soft tissue compromise, and we need imaging before you do anything with that arm. She listened to all of it and said, "Okay," at the appropriate intervals and watched the canyon disappear behind them in the dust-hazed pre-dawn. Dunn was in the vehicle ahead of hers. She could see him through the windshield. He'd given his seat to Pike and was sitting on the vehicle floor with his back against the bulkhead, and he was very still in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion. She recognized it. It was the stillness that arrives when you've been tightly wound for a long time, and the thing that required the winding is over, and your body doesn't know yet how to go back to the other mode. She'd been in that stillness before. Not often. Twice, maybe 3 times. You didn't exactly remember what came right before it. You remembered what it felt like to sit in it. By the time they reached Forward Base Talon, the storm had reduced itself to a moving haze at the western perimeter, grumbling. The flight line was empty except for 2 parked aircraft and the visible gap where her helicopter used to be tied down, which was the kind of absence that told a story without any words. Colonel Shaw was waiting at the operations building. He was not waiting outside. That would have suggested urgency, or the kind of personal investment that he'd apparently decided didn't apply to this situation. He was waiting inside, at the head of the operations table, with a cup of coffee and a legal pad and the expression of a man who had spent the last hour constructing something he believed was airtight. Pierce walked in first. Claire followed. 2 of Pierce's team came in behind them, which wasn't protocol for a post-mission debrief, but which nobody challenged. Shaw looked at Claire, at her arm held close against her body, at the state of her flight suit, dust, a long tear on the left knee from the crash, something that might have been someone else's blood on the right cuff that she hadn't addressed yet. "Sit down, Lieutenant," he said. "I'll stand." A beat. Shaw's expression recalibrated slightly. "Sit down," he said again, in the tone of a man who is offering something that isn't actually an offer. She sat. Not because he told her to, because Ochoa had been insisting on it for the last 20 minutes and standing was taking energy she didn't currently have to spare. Shaw opened his legal pad. "At 0217 hours, you departed forward base Talon without authorization in a transport aircraft you are not rated on, conducted a second unauthorized departure after being explicitly ordered to stand down, destroyed a military aircraft valued at approximately $4.2 million, and discharged a firearm in a combat zone while operating outside your designated assignment parameters." He looked up. "Is there anything in that summary you'd like to dispute?" The room was quiet. Claire looked at him. She was tired enough that her face wasn't doing the things faces do when people are managing their expressions. The carefully neutral look, the suppressed reaction. She was just looking at him. "I brought back 12 soldiers," she said. "You destroyed a $4 million aircraft." "I brought back 12 soldiers," she said again. Same words, same tone, like she was reading coordinates. "And in the process, you violated direct orders, operated outside your certification, and—" "Colonel." Pierce's voice was level, but it had the quality of a door closing. "With respect, the debrief can wait until Lieutenant Halden has been seen by medical. She has a shoulder injury that—" "The debrief happens now, Captain, before accounts get compared and stories get aligned." Shaw's eyes moved to Pierce. "That applies to you as well. You authorized an unsanctioned flight, which makes you equally—" "I authorized a rescue attempt after you declined to conduct one," Pierce said. "I'm comfortable with that distinction." Shaw set down his pen. He looked at Pierce the way he'd looked at Claire in the briefing room 4 hours ago. The same rapid calculation, the same measurement of cost and leverage. But something in it was different now, and Claire, even through the exhaustion, could see what it was. Pierce was not managing his expression either, and Pierce had 12 more years of operational record than she did, which meant the calculation wasn't coming out the same way. "Your comfort with the distinction," Shaw said carefully, "doesn't alter the regulatory reality." "No," Pierce agreed, "but the radio recordings might." Shaw went still. "All transmissions on tactical and base frequencies are logged," Pierce said. "That's a standing operational requirement, which means there is a recording of your order to stand down at 0217 hours, your refusal to authorize additional rescue attempts, and your direct order to Lieutenant Halden to abort the second flight." He paused. "There's also a recording of her response, and mine, and the subsequent comms from Echo Patrol during the extraction." He picked up the coffee cup on the table that nobody had invited him to touch and set it to one side so he could put his hands flat on the table. "I want to make sure you've thought about that before we continue this conversation." The fluorescent lights hummed. One of them was still at half power, still strobing slightly, the same one from earlier. Nobody had fixed it. Shaw looked at Pierce for a long moment. Then he looked down at his legal pad. "The recordings will be part of any formal review," he said. His voice had changed register, not retreated. Shaw wasn't the kind of person who retreated, but moved to a more careful position. "As will the maintenance reports, the flight logs, and the statement of anyone involved." "Yes," Pierce said. "They will." Another silence. "Get her to medical," Shaw said. He was looking at his legal pad when he said it. The aid station was a modular building behind the operations center. 2 examination bays and a small imaging room that had an X-ray machine old enough to have a manufacturing date that predated some of the personnel using it. Ochoa walked Claire through the imaging process with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this in worse conditions, and the results came back showing what he'd suspected: a partial dislocation of the left shoulder, the joint having been stressed beyond its comfortable range during the climb over the fuselage. The socket had largely returned to position on its own, which was the good news. The surrounding musculature was going to have opinions about that for several weeks, which was the other news. Ochoa gave her a sling, an ice pack, 2 things for the pain that she accepted without argument for the first time in a medical context in recent memory, and the information that she would not be flying for a minimum of 4 weeks pending a proper orthopedic evaluation. She sat with that for a moment. 4 weeks, she said. Minimum, Ochoa said. And that's if the soft tissue said, okay. She stood up. He started to say something else, and she looked at him. Thank you, she said, which was more than she usually managed in medical settings, and she walked out. The base was doing the thing bases do when something significant has happened at night. A particular quality of controlled motion, people moving with purpose but quietly, the way people move when they're not sure what the official posture is supposed to be yet and are waiting for someone to tell them. 2 mechanics who had worked on her aircraft during the turnaround were standing outside the maintenance bay. They looked at her when she came past. Neither of them said anything, but one of them, she thought his name was Reyes, not the same Reyes from the gorge, a different one, gave her a nod that had a quality she didn't quite have words for. She went to the mess. Not because she was hungry, she wasn't, or she genuinely couldn't tell, but because the mess had coffee at all hours, and she needed something warm to hold. Valdez was already there. She was sitting at a corner table with a cup in front of her that she wasn't drinking from, looking at the middle distance with the expression of someone who is running a post-mission processing loop and hasn't decided when to stop it. Her hands were on the table, and Claire noticed for the first time that they were still marked with what she'd been doing in the canyon. Trace evidence of the work that had kept Leah Monroe's heart doing what hearts are supposed to do. Claire got coffee and sat down across from her. They sat without talking for about 2 minutes. She's in surgery, Valdez said. They called from the hospital 40 minutes ago. Monroe. She went straight in. Okay. They said the field treatment. Valdez stopped, looked at her cup. They said it bought her time, that without the field intervention, she probably wouldn't have made it to surgery. You did good work in there. I didn't. Valdez pressed her lips together, started again. I was scared the whole time. I know. I kept thinking about. She stopped again. Whatever she'd been about to say, she put it away somewhere. It doesn't matter. It does, Claire said. Just not right now. Valdez looked at her. Something in her face shifted. Not quite relief, but close to the neighborhood. How's the shoulder? Partial dislocation. 4 weeks minimum. That's going to drive you absolutely insane. Probably. You're not going to do the 4 weeks. I'm going to do the 4 weeks. Valdez looked at her with the expression of someone who doesn't believe this but has made the decision not to argue about it at 0500 hours in the mess hall. Dunn came in 20 minutes later. He got food, real food, eggs and whatever the powdered protein situation was that the mess called a protein option, and sat at the end of their table and ate with the concentrated focus of someone whose body has finally sent a very urgent message about caloric deficit. He didn't say anything while he was eating. When he was done, he pushed the tray aside and put his elbows on the table. Pike's in medical, he said. They're going to evac him in the morning. The leg is, he made a gesture. It's not good, but it's not. He'll keep it. Good, Claire said. He asked me to. Dunn stopped, looked at the table. He said to tell you he's glad you came back for the second flight. She didn't say anything. I told him that seemed like an understatement, Dunn said. It is, Valdez said. Dunn looked at Claire. He had the kind of face that showed its interior states without much filtration. Right now it was showing something that was still working out what category it belonged in. Can I ask you something? Probably. When Shaw told you to stand down, on the radio, you switched channels. He paused. What were you thinking when you did that? Claire looked at her coffee. I was thinking about the 5 names I was still carrying, she said. Dunn was quiet for a moment. Just that? Just that. She looked up at him. I wasn't being heroic. I wasn't making a statement. I just didn't have a version of myself that could fly back and land and sit with 5 names. He nodded slowly, like he was filing that somewhere specific. I'm going to sleep, Valdez announced. She stood up, picked up her cup, and looked at Claire. You should also sleep. I know. You're not going to. Probably not. Valdez left. Dunn left a few minutes later after saying something quiet that Claire heard but didn't immediately process because she was already somewhere else in her head, working through the conversation with Shaw, working through the radio logs that Pierce had mentioned, working through what a formal review actually looked like from the inside when you were the subject of it, rather than a witness. She'd been through one review before, not as the subject, adjacent to one, close enough to understand the machinery of it. That was the situation with her previous commanding officer, the targeting decision that had ended her assignment with the 4th Attack Battalion. She hadn't been found at fault in that review. She hadn't been found not at fault either. The result had been the kind of administrative ambiguity that gets resolved by moving people to different assignments and not discussing it further. She'd been angry about that for a long time. She was less angry about it now, in the way that proximity to something genuinely high stakes had a way of recalibrating what you thought was worth carrying. She was still sitting with the coffee when Pierce came in at 0540. He got nothing from the mess, just walked over and sat down across from her in the chair Valdez had vacated, and he looked at her in the direct way he had that was not invasive but was absolutely present. How's the shoulder? He said. Ochoa covered it. I'm not asking Ochoa. She looked at him. It's manageable. 4 weeks? That's what he said. That's what he... Pierce nodded. He put his hands on the table. He had the kind of stillness that came from having been through enough versions of the night they'd just had that the processing happened faster, more automatically, took up less visible space. But he wasn't completely still. There was something in the way he was sitting that suggested he'd come here to say something specific and was deciding how to say it. The review board will convene in about 72 hours, he said. Standard procedure for a mission that resulted in equipment loss. Shaw has already submitted a preliminary incident report. What does it say? Unauthorized flight, pilot operating outside certification, equipment destroyed due to pilot error and unsafe conditions. He paused. It says very little about why the conditions existed in the first place, or what the alternative outcome would have been. She looked at the table. He has the authority to submit that report. He does, and we have the authority to respond to it. Pierce looked at her. Which we will, in detail, with documentation. The radio logs, the maintenance reports, the weight differential on the stripped aircraft, which, by the way, is documented because Costa logged the modifications as required before any departure, which means there's a paper trail showing a deliberate preparation for a specific flight profile, which is not how reckless pilot error usually gets documented. He said it without satisfaction, just stating it. And 12 survivor statements, separate, independent, collected before anyone has the opportunity to compare notes. Claire looked at him. You started collecting statements already. I started collecting statements while you were in imaging. He held her gaze. I've done this before. She absorbed that. There was something in the sentence that suggested more context than it was offering, and she filed it without pressing. And Shaw? Shaw will say what Shaw needs to say to protect himself. That's predictable. What's also predictable is that the review board will have access to all the same documentation we do, and they'll have 12 people telling them the same story, and they'll have a record showing that the pilot he called unqualified threaded a 14-meter canyon passage twice in a zero-vis dust storm and brought back every person she went in for. Pierce was quiet for a moment. That's not nothing. It's not nothing, she agreed, but he has the rank. He has the rank today. Pierce said it simply, like he was reading a weather forecast. She understood what he meant. She didn't say anything about it. There's something else, Pierce said. He shifted slightly. Not discomfort, preparation. I pulled your record last night, before I authorized the flight. She went still. The incident with the 4th Attack Battalion, he said. The targeting call. She said nothing. I read the review summary, the thing that wasn't resolved. He met her eyes. You were right, weren't you? It wasn't a question. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that wasn't quite anything, not defensiveness, not relief at being asked, just the careful assessment of a person deciding whether to have a conversation she'd been not having for 2 years. The review didn't say I was right, she said. The review didn't say a lot of things, but I read what was available, and I've done enough targeting work to read between the lines. He paused. Your former CO didn't want a definitive finding because a definitive finding would have meant accounting for his own call that preceded yours. She looked at her coffee cup. Yes, she said, quietly. I was right. Pierce nodded once. He didn't make a thing of it, didn't respond with the kind of validation that would have made the moment feel like something she needed. He just received it and moved on. The reason I'm telling you this, he said, is that the review board for this incident will likely pull the same background file. And when they see an unresolved prior incident, they're going to read it either as a pattern or as a context. I'd like it to be a context. Meaning you want to know what actually happened. Meaning I want to know what actually happened so that if it becomes relevant, I'm not blindsided by something that should have been in front of me. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she told him. Not everything. There wasn't time for everything, and some of it she'd put in a place she didn't open casually, but the essential structure of it. The patrol, the target assessment, the competing intelligence reports, the call her CO had made that she'd documented her disagreement with, and then the subsequent call she'd made that the CO had labeled insubordinate, and what had actually been at the target coordinates when later information came in, which had validated her original assessment in a way that the formal record had declined to explicitly say. Pierce listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You submitted the disagreement in writing before the call, he said. Yes. It's in the file? It should be. Whether it's in the part they give the review board, she shrugged, which cost her something with the shoulder, and she stopped shrugging. I don't know. I'll find it, he said. He said it like someone noting a task on a list, unhurried, certain it was findable. She looked at him. Why are you doing this? Pierce looked back at her. It wasn't a question he seemed surprised by. Because you went into that canyon twice, he said, and both times you came back with people. And because Shaw is going to spend the next 72 hours building a version of tonight that protects him. And I'm not willing to let that version be the one that stands. He stood up. Get some rest, he said. The board convenes in 72 hours, and I need you sharp. I'm always sharp. You have a partially dislocated shoulder and you've been awake for approximately 22 hours. I'm always sharp, she said again. The corner of his mouth moved in a way that might have been something, and then he walked out. She sat alone in the mess with the fourth bad cup of coffee of the night, and watched the light outside the window change from gray to something almost pale yellow, the sun beginning its own long approach toward the Karaf wastes from behind the eastern ridgeline. Somewhere north of here, Leah Monroe was in a surgical suite with people working to make sure she woke up. Somewhere in the operations building, Shaw was drafting language. Somewhere in the canyon, the wreck of her aircraft was settling into the stone, the emergency light still blinking amber in the dark. She finished the coffee. It was bad. She drank it anyway. The review board convened on the third day. Not 72 hours exactly. It was 76, because one of the 3 board members had been delayed at a regional command center and the session couldn't proceed without a quorum, and those 4 extra hours had the particular quality of time that passes very slowly when you're waiting for something you've already decided you can't control. Claire spent them in the way she'd spent most of the previous 3 days. In the aid station for the appointments Ochoa kept scheduling, in the planning room studying terrain files she didn't currently have assignment for, and in the mess drinking coffee that never got better. She did not sleep well. She slept in 3- and 4-hour increments, waking at sounds that turned out to be the wind or the generator cycling, lying in the dark with her shoulder in the sling and her mind running through things it had no productive reason to run through at 0300 hours. The targeting call from the 4th Battalion. The moment the tail assembly let go. The sound of Valdez's voice saying she has a pulse in a destroyed aircraft in the bottom of a canyon. The second night, she stopped trying to sleep and went back to the planning room and spent 4 hours writing down everything she remembered about both flights. Not for the review board, not for Pierce, just for herself, in the particular order her memory produced it, including the parts that were unflattering. The moments of doubt. The altimeter stuttering, the gray that came into the edges of her vision on the wreck when her shoulder took the weight wrong. She wrote those parts down with the same specificity as everything else, because she had long ago developed a suspicion that the accurate version of anything was more useful than the heroic version, even when the accurate version made you look worse. She left the document in the planning room when she was done. Not filed, not for anyone, just written. On the morning of the board, Pierce found her in the corridor outside the operations building. He was in his service uniform, which she'd never seen him in. He was almost always in field gear, and the formal uniform made him look like a slightly different version of the same person, more angular somehow. "Board is ready," he said. "I know." He looked at her. "You look like you haven't slept." "I slept some." "How much?" "Enough to function." "That's not a number." "No," she agreed. "It's not." He studied her for a moment with the expression that she'd come to understand meant he was deciding whether to say the next thing. Then he said it. "The document you wrote, in the planning room." She went still. "You read it." "I found it at 400 when I was pulling materials for the board. I read the first page before I understood what it was." He met her eyes. "I stopped there." She said nothing. "I want you to know that," he said, "that I stopped." "Okay." "What I saw in the first page," he paused. "It was honest in a way that I think would have helped you and hurt you simultaneously in a board context. I'm glad it's not in front of them." "It wasn't for them. I know that now." He glanced at the door. "Are you ready?" She straightened, her shoulder pulled when she did, a reminder she didn't need. "Yeah." "Then let's go." The board convened in the same briefing room where it had started, the room with the flickering overhead light, which someone had finally fixed in the intervening 3 days, which meant the room was now evenly lit and had lost the particular shadowed quality it had carried on the night in question. Claire noticed this and thought that it was the kind of small change that made you understand how much atmosphere is just lighting and how dangerous that is. 3 board members. Colonel Adisa, who ran the Regional Aviation Command and had the kind of face that had been trained over decades to reveal exactly nothing during formal proceedings. Major Chen, who was a legal affairs officer Claire had never met, with a pad of notes in front of her so covered in writing that it was hard to imagine she'd written it all in 76 hours. And Lieutenant Colonel Marsh, who was the aviation safety inspector for the Western sector, and who had already, Claire knew, reviewed the maintenance logs for the aircraft. Shaw sat to the left of the board table, not at it, an observer position, which technically was all he was in this proceeding since he'd submitted his report already. He was in his service uniform, hands folded, the expression of a man who was confident in his documentation and waiting for the documentation to do its work. Pierce sat to Claire's right. He had a folder on the table in front of him that was thick enough to have weight. Adisa opened the session without ceremony. She stated the date, the parties present, the subject of the review, the loss of a military transport aircraft during a mission conducted on the night in question, and the determination of whether the mission fell within or outside authorized operational parameters. She said all of this in the flat, procedural tone that formal military proceedings use, which has the effect of making everything sound pre-decided even when it isn't. Then she looked at Claire. "Lieutenant Halden, you conducted both flights." "Yes, ma'am." "You were not rated on the transport configuration of the aircraft." "No, ma'am." "You departed on the second flight after being explicitly ordered to stand down." "Yes, ma'am." Adisa wrote something on her pad. "Walk me through the decision to depart on the second flight. Not the logistics, the decision." Claire had been expecting the logistics question. The decision question was different, and she took a moment with it, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wanted to say it accurately. "There were 5 people still in the gorge," she said. "Corporal Monroe was critical. I had an aircraft that the mechanics believed was flyable for one more flight, a route I had already navigated twice, and the information that without another extraction attempt, those 5 people's probability of survival before weather cleared was," she paused, "very low. And the order to stand down? I heard it. But you departed anyway." "Yes, ma'am." Adisa looked at her steadily. "Why?" Claire met her eyes. "Because the order was wrong." The room was very quiet. Shaw shifted slightly in his chair. It was the first movement he'd made. You made a unilateral determination that a direct order from a superior officer was operationally incorrect, Adisa said. And you acted on that determination. Yes, ma'am. That's a significant thing to say in front of a review board. I know. Claire kept her voice level. But I'm not going to say something different because the honest version sounds worse. The order was wrong. I knew it was wrong. I had information that made it wrong. The geological survey data, the navigational route, the aircraft weight profile after the modifications. Colonel Shaw issued the stand down without access to that information and without asking for it. She paused. I'm not saying he made a dishonest call. I'm saying he made an incomplete one. And the consequence of not acting on what I knew was 5 people. Silence. Marsh, the aviation safety inspector, leaned forward slightly. He was a compact man with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead that he kept forgetting to use. The weight modification. Tell me about the stripped configuration. This was ground Pierce had prepared her for, and she walked through it methodically. The removal of weapons systems, armor plating, auxiliary equipment, the calculated weight reduction of 430 kilograms, the relationship between that reduction and the rotor clearance in the 14-meter passage. Marsh listened without interrupting, occasionally writing something, occasionally looking at the maintenance logs in front of him that she knew Costa had filed correctly, because Pierce had told her 3 days ago that Costa had filed them correctly, and Costa had the kind of reputation for documentation that made review boards calm down. When she finished, Marsh looked at the logs. The modifications were documented before departure. Yes, sir. By the crew chief and the senior mechanic on duty. Yes, sir. That's not how reckless improvisation usually gets documented, Marsh said. It was a dry observation, not directed at anyone specifically, but it landed in the room at a specific angle. Shaw's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, but Claire was close enough to see it. Chen, the legal officer, spoke for the first time. Lieutenant Halden, there's a prior incident on your record, with the 4th Attack Battalion, an unresolved finding regarding a targeting decision. Pierce opened his folder. The board has the full documentation on that incident, including Lieutenant Halden's written dissent submitted prior to the operational call in question. He slid a section of the folder toward the board table. The relevant detail is that Lieutenant Halden documented her assessment before events, which is not the behavior pattern of an officer who acts recklessly on personal judgment. It's the behavior pattern of an officer who acts on professional assessment and maintains a record of having done so. Chen looked at the documents. Read for a moment. The finding was unresolved. The finding was incomplete, Pierce said. The review at the time declined to make a definitive determination on the primary targeting assessment, which subsequent intelligence information validated. He said it plainly, without argument in his voice. Just stating what the documents showed, Chen made a note. She had the focused expression of someone for whom documents are their natural habitat, and the documents in front of her were telling her something she was taking seriously. Adisa looked at Shaw. Colonel, your incident report characterized the second flight as being conducted without basis in operational data. In light of the geological survey, documentation, and the maintenance records, do you have additional context for that characterization? Shaw unfolded his hands and refolded them. It was a small movement, and it cost him something to make it look casual. My characterization was based on the information available to me at the time of the stand-down order, he said. Lieutenant Halden did not present the geological survey data in sufficient detail for me to assess its operational validity. Adisa looked at the transcript in front of her, the radio log. She read from it without preamble. Lieutenant Halden stated at 0221 hours that the secondary passage had canyon walls averaging 22 meters, creating a natural windbreak, and that wind velocity inside the channel would be significantly reduced. She looked up. Is that insufficient detail, Colonel? Shaw was quiet for 3 full seconds. I made a judgment call, he said, based on pilot qualifications and weather conditions. You made a judgment call, Adisa repeated, not echoing it, weighing it. The room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when something has been said that everyone understands the significance of and nobody is going to be the first to name directly. Adisa closed the transcript. She looked at her colleagues. Some kind of communication passed between the 3 of them that had no visible component. We'll recess for deliberation, she said. Thank you, Lieutenant. The recess lasted 40 minutes. Claire sat in the corridor outside with Pierce, who was doing something on his phone that he appeared to be actually reading and not just looking at to have something to look at. She was doing the thing where you stare at a fixed point on a wall and your eyes are open, but you're not actually seeing anything, which is a form of rest that isn't rest, but is better than nothing. 40 minutes is not a long deliberation for a board, Pierce said, without looking up from his phone. I know. It could mean they had a clear view quickly, or they have questions and are trying to agree on how to ask them. Also possible. He put the phone in his pocket. What are you thinking? I'm thinking about Monroe, she said, not because it was relevant to the board, just because it was true. I keep thinking about whether the field treatment actually made the difference, or whether she was going to survive anyway. Valdez thinks it made the difference. I know what Valdez thinks. And you think Valdez is... I think Valdez knows what she's talking about. Claire looked at the wall. I just also know that we'll never have the version where we didn't do it, so we can't actually know. Pierce was quiet for a moment. Does that bother you? She thought about it. No, I think I just need to acknowledge it. That we made the call we made and the outcome was what it was. And I don't get to own the outcome the same way I own the call. He nodded. He seemed to understand what she meant, which was either a professional quality or a personal one, and she couldn't determine which. The door opened. The board's findings were delivered in the same flat procedural language that had opened the session, which meant that every sentence arrived in the same register as every other sentence, and you had to listen for the content rather than the tone. The aircraft loss was formally classified as a combat equipment loss during an active extraction operation. Not pilot error. Not unauthorized destruction. Combat loss. The mission itself was classified as an unauthorized departure conducted in response to an active casualty emergency, which was a specific category in military aviation regulations that existed precisely because the people who wrote those regulations understood that emergencies sometimes happen faster than authorization processes. It was not a full exoneration. The unauthorized element was noted formally, but it was characterized as a judgment call made by an experienced pilot in possession of relevant operational information, under conditions where the consequence of inaction was documented and significant. The prior incident from the 4th Battalion was formally noted as unresolved in the record, but the board indicated in their written summary, which Pierce would show her later, that the pattern of documented pre-action assessment visible in both incidents suggested an officer whose judgment process was systematic rather than impulsive. That finding didn't reverse what had happened at the 4th Battalion, but it put it in a different light, the kind of different light that didn't change history but changed how history sat in a file. Claire and Pierce were cleared. Shaw was not censured in the formal language of the board's findings. The board's charter didn't extend to censuring officers for stand-down decisions, even ones that looked different in retrospect. But the findings were explicit that the operational information presented to the base commander at 0221 hours was sufficient to support an alternative assessment of mission viability, which was the board's way of saying what it couldn't formally say. 3 weeks after the board, Shaw was reassigned. Claire heard about it from Valdez, who had heard about it from someone in regional command, and the information arrived in the flat matter-of-fact way that bureaucratic information usually arrives. Not a dramatic reversal, just a transfer to an administrative command position at a supply facility 2 sectors north. A job where the decisions he made involved inventory and personnel rosters and nothing that breathed. The word reassigned covered a lot of ground in military language. Sometimes it meant nothing. This time, Claire believed, it meant something. She visited Monroe at the hospital on day 31. The shoulder had been evaluated, re-evaluated, treated with a combination of physical therapy and time that she'd found deeply frustrating in the way that all processes dependent on time are frustrating to people who move fast. She'd done the therapy correctly and completely, which surprised Ochoa enough that he mentioned it, and she'd done it correctly and completely. Not because she was disciplined about it, but because the alternative was a shoulder that didn't work properly. And a shoulder that didn't work properly was a problem she couldn't afford in her actual life. The hospital was a regional facility, clean and too cold the way hospitals are always too cold, with that particular institutional smell that mixes disinfectant with something else underneath it, that you never quite identify. Monroe was in a room on the 3rd floor that had a window looking east toward a flat stretch of terrain that was featureless and honest in the way the Karif landscape was featureless and honest, nothing pretending to be something it wasn't. She was sitting up when Claire arrived. Not fully upright, there was a stack of pillows doing architectural work, but upright enough that she looked like a person in a bed rather than a person being kept alive in a bed, which was a distinction that mattered. She was 24 years old. Claire had known this from the file, but it hit differently in person. The particular youth of her face, the way her features hadn't fully settled into what they were going to be yet. There was a scar on the right side of her head where the hair hadn't grown back yet, a clean line from the surgery, and she wore it the way young people sometimes wear the marks of things that happened to them. Not ignoring it, but not performing it either, just carrying it. She looked at Claire when she came in, and something shifted in her expression that Claire couldn't fully read. Not quite recognition. They'd never met. Monroe had been unconscious for the only time they'd been in the same space, but something adjacent to it, like recognizing the shape of a story she'd been told. "Lieutenant Halden," she said. "You don't have to. You can call me Claire." Monroe looked at her for a moment. "Claire," she said, like she was testing the weight of it. Claire sat in the chair beside the bed. She'd brought nothing. She'd thought about bringing something and then decided that bringing something would make the visit feel like an obligation she was completing rather than a thing she'd needed to do, and she didn't want it to feel like that. "How are you?" she asked. It was an inadequate question, and she knew it. "Better than the last time you saw me," Monroe said. There was something dry in it, not quite humor, but the territory adjacent to humor that people occupy when something is still close enough to be painful but far enough to be named. "That's a low bar." "Yeah." Monroe looked at the window. "They told me what happened, the whole thing. Sergeant Pike told me. Valdez came and told me." She paused. "Dunn sent a letter. Actual paper. Who does that?" "Dunn, apparently." Monroe almost smiled. "He's a good kid." "He is." A silence settled. Not uncomfortable. The particular kind of silence that exists between people who have been in the same event without being present at the same moment of it, who share a history that only partially overlaps. "I dreamed about my mother's kitchen," Monroe said suddenly. "While I was, during whatever was happening, I've been trying to figure out why that, of all places." "Because it was safe," Claire said. It wasn't a profound observation, just the accurate one. Monroe looked at her. "Did you think I was going to make it?" Claire held her gaze. "I thought you were worth going back for." Monroe was quiet for a moment. Then something in her face changed in a way that had nothing performative about it. Just a shift, a settling, the look of someone who has been carrying a question without knowing it was a question and has just gotten an answer. "Valdez said you climbed over the top of the helicopter," Monroe said, "to get the shooter on the ledge." "I did." "With a partially dislocated shoulder." "It wasn't fully dislocated." "That's your defense? It wasn't fully dislocated?" "It was a partial," Claire said. "Technically better." Monroe looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between disbelief and something warmer, and she said, very quietly, "Thank you." The words sat in the room. Claire didn't deflect it or minimize it or do any of the things that people do with gratitude when they don't know how to hold it. She just let it sit there. "You're welcome," she said. They talked for another 30 minutes. Not about the canyon, about other things. The hospital food, Monroe's family who were driving in from the coast, a book Monroe was reading that she described as simultaneously very good and extremely irritating, the way only the best books are. Claire talked more than she usually talked, which wasn't much in absolute terms, but was more than Monroe had probably expected from the quiet pilot everyone described. She left when Monroe's eyes started to do the thing that said the fatigue was winning, said goodbye without ceremony, and walked back down the corridor toward the elevator. In the elevator, she stood with her back against the rear wall, and her hands at her sides, and the shoulder ached with the particular dull persistence of something that was healing correctly but hadn't finished healing yet. And she thought about Monroe saying, "I dreamed about my mother's kitchen," with the slightly dazed quality of someone still surprised to be in a position to tell anyone about it. She was cleared to fly on day 38. Not combat certified. That would take another evaluation cycle, another sign-off, the bureaucratic sequence that applied to everyone and that she had no interest in trying to shortcut. But flight certified, able to get in an aircraft, run a startup sequence, and leave the ground, which was the part that mattered most immediately. Pierce arranged for the aircraft. He did it without making anything of it, just left a message that the helicopter on Pad 3 was available for a familiarization flight starting at 0700 if she wanted it. She was on the pad at 0650. She didn't notice them until she was halfway through the pre-flight walk-around. A group gathered at the edge of the flight line, not in formation, not organized, just people standing, the way people stand when they've come somewhere with no official reason and no coordination and found others who had the same instinct at the same time. She recognized some of them. 3 of the mechanics who had worked on her aircraft the night of the extraction. Reyes from Echo Patrol, who was back on base for a transit stop and apparently had a sense of timing. Dunn, who was still assigned to Talon and was standing with his hands in his pockets in the diffident way he had. Valdez was there. She caught Claire's eye and gave her the slight nod that was her version of a large gesture. Pike wasn't there. He was still in rehabilitation, his leg requiring the kind of extended work that didn't allow for casual travel. But he'd sent a message through Dunn, which Dunn had written on a notepad in his careful block handwriting, and which Claire had read twice and then folded and put in her flight suit pocket. She finished the pre-flight, got in, started the sequence. The rotors came up, and she felt the familiar vibration move through the airframe, through the seat, through her hands on the controls, that particular aliveness of a machine that is ready to do what it was built for. The shoulder held. It pulled at the outer edge of the movement range. She'd been warned about that. The physical therapist had been very specific about which movements would pull and for how long. But it held, and it was manageable, and manageable was what she needed. She keyed the radio. Talon Control. Rescue flight on Pad 3. Requesting departure clearance for familiarization flight. The answer came back clean and immediate. Rescue flight, Talon Control. You're cleared for departure. Welcome back, Lieutenant. She increased collective. The helicopter lifted off the pad, and as it rose, she could see the flight line below and the people standing at its edge. And she didn't wave because you don't wave from a helicopter cockpit when you're managing liftoff. But she saw them. She saw Valdez's upward nod and Dunn with his hands still in his pockets, and the mechanics who had stripped her aircraft down to its bones in 45 minutes on a night when it mattered, and she carried all of them for exactly the length of time it took to climb to pattern altitude. And then she put her eyes on the horizon and flew. The Karif waste spread beneath her in the early morning light, flat and ancient and indifferent to everything that had happened in the dark 3 weeks ago. The canyon was somewhere to the south, visible from altitude as a dark cut in the terrain. She didn't avoid looking at it. She looked at it the way you look at the place where something happened, directly, without drama, acknowledging it was real. The aircraft was whole and light and honest beneath her hands. She set a heading east and pushed the throttle up. Some people wait for permission to act. They wait for the right rank, the right moment, the right guarantee that the cost won't be too high. But the people who change outcomes are usually the ones who looked around the room, saw that no one else was moving, and stood up anyway. Not because they weren't afraid, but because they decided that what was on the other side of the fear was worth more than the safety of staying seated. Courage is not the absence of doubt. It's the decision that some things matter more than your doubt does.